I think there's actually quite a bit that can be done. I mean, obviously, there's more wealth in these couple counties. It's of course not completely dispersed, but than any other few counties in the country. And so I think when I was doing community organizing, we always used to say there's two types of power. There's organized people and there's organized money. And I do think that you can organize your resources and your people towards public ends. Just because this is a blue state doesn't mean it's always been friendly to immigrants. I mean, most folks who hopefully I'm not going to judge ages in the room, remember Prop 187 and, the more recent shift in California that happened politically. It was only a few years ago that all Californians, including undocumented Californians, were able to get Medi-Cal and access to Medicare, medical care. So I would say stay awake because that's not necessary. It can be fragile. The other thing that I'll mention is 1/3 of our work at Define American is in the entertainment, media, and pop culture space. So we've now consulted just in the last couple of years on over 60 different television shows, reaching 39 million plus people. And a lot of folks don't realize 80% now, thanks to streaming services, 80% of the entire entertainment media that's consumed globally is produced in California. The narratives that you all choose to support, the stories you choose to tell or not tell, and how you tell them impact perception across the globe. And they impact perception in towns like mine in Louisville, Kentucky. We all watch the shows that you create right here and have access to. And so it's why when Grey's Anatomy, for example, we had been talking to them for a while because they're one of the only shows that reaches purple America still. Yeah, I don't know if you're aware, entertainment media is even more polarized than political. There was a study done right after the election by Time that said if you wanted to know what was a stronger correlation, who people voted for in the last election, their political party or if they voted for George W. Bush, or if they were viewers of Duck Dynasty versus Orange is the New Black, the TV show was more of a determinant. So I say all that to say we select shows and get invited many times in, like Grey's Anatomy, because they reach millions of people. And we said, well, the current narrative is that undocumented people stereotypically are Latinx, from violent backgrounds or something. Why don't we have the first undocumented character who's a doctor? And so we brought in a bunch of undocumented doctors to that writer's room, and they just shared their stories. They were peppered for 2 hours with questions about their stories. And then months later, of course, the first undocumented doctor became one of the members on, the cast of Grey's Anatomy. And so we've done that with comedy and other things. But I say all that to say, your voice is your vote also. What you choose to watch and what you choose not to watch. And so that is influential. I mean, you're in a state that has about roughly 3 million undocumented folks just in California, undocumented Californians. Okay, there are like 3.5 million people total in the state of Kentucky. How you treat one another matters. It doesn't matter to me, frankly, what the president says or politicians say about someone being what he called my cousins and my family on the Mexican side, rapists. It matters more how I treat those people, whether I welcome them into my home. I'm not saying what the president doesn't say matters. I'm saying what matters is we don't have to always act in the way that they would hope that we would act. And so as the state with more immigrants, not just undocumented, than any other place in the country, I think you have an opportunity to show us the way. When they're saying crime will go up with more migration, you can show us the way. When they're saying that communities that are diverse can't ever have a hope of being connected and bonded to one another and being successful, you can show them the way. You can say, well, we have great diversity in our communities and we're thriving together. And so that's what I would say. And maybe when Mitch McConnell's up for re-election this next year, fly to Kentucky and do some door knocking.
Yeah. Two people asked, what is the implications of the Supreme Court's hearing this week on DACA? What happens in either direction of what the Supreme Court decides, and maybe explain for some folks why Tuesday and the Supreme Court is so important to your work?
I first, in answering that question, want to acknowledge that my friends that were in the Obama administration don't like it when I say this. We first need to recognize that the system that was created to house families and separate them more generally, and the deportation systems were created under previous administrations. And acknowledge that over 3 million people, more still so far, were deported under the Obama administration, more than any administration in U.S. history. So I do want to acknowledge that, just not to have a false equivalency, but to say that in light of that, under a lot of pressure, deferred action for childhood arrivals, DACA, came about because of heroes like Gabby Pacheco, who's on our board, who marched in the early days from Miami to Washington, D.C. to share their story and to demand some sort of relief. And at that time, the Obama administration felt very strongly that if they could just show the other side of the aisle that they were tough on immigrants, they could pass some pretty major legislation. And after 3 different Congresses, that became, obvious that that was not going to happen. And so their only option was administrative relief. And so they created DACA, a new program where you have to pay $500 in order to get the government not to agree not to deport you for 2 years. That's DACA. People often miss the deferred action. The action in deferred is deportation. So DACA was never meant to be a continual thing, but in the absence of any action, DACA became a promise that our country made to mostly young people who were brought here as children and could meet certain criteria. And so 700,000 kids right now are still under DACA, just under 700,000. They have work permits at varying degrees that allow them to stay in the country for every couple years. They have to reapply. President Trump, in his first few months in office, got rid of it. Some of our partners immediately sued. That's where it's been. So the Supreme Court, hearing that case, is a final decision on whether or not the program will continue. If the program discontinues, we will have 700,000 young people that the government has all of their information. They have their fingerprint in more recent iterations, blood tests, address. They know everything about, who will lose the ability to work, in some cases lose the ability to go to school, and in many cases would face deportation. And the government would have the information that they need to quicken that deportation. So it is a quite serious thing, and it's also unfortunate that we're not incredibly confident that the Supreme Court is going to rule in favor of the young people with DACA. Yeah. And so when Jesus talked about housing people, when I talk about being community, being beloved community for people, I think communities are going to have to make decisions. Tim Cook said he has 400 DACA folks at Microsoft. Apple. Ooh, I'm not from the Bay and I'm tired. That's a huge mistake here.
Don't offend
Huge
this
mistake.
crowd.
Well, and he said, no matter what happens, I'm going to stick with these kids. And frankly, they're not kids anymore. But I'm going to stick with them. Well, are you going to hire 400 contractors then? If we have students in school, are those schools going to stick with the students? If they have scholarships, and now you can't use government money to give them scholarship, are you going to stick with them? If they get deported, are these schools going to continue to allow the students some pathway to finish their education? Yeah. I think that's the question that we all face, is what are we going to do in response to what would be a crisis of our own creation and a breaking of America's promise to these young people?
I mean, from a legislative standpoint, once the Supreme Court makes their decision, there's no other additional legislative pathway. So the only pathway that we're left with is the local and communal pathway. Is that a fair assessment, or?
Yeah, I think it's fair. I mean, Congress any day could pass some sort of legislation. We're not confident that that is going to happen. Right. The country's very divided. About 25%, particularly of the electorate on one side of the aisle, immigration is their number one and number two issue, and they're very agitated around what they view as a shift in American culture and identity. And so there aren't very many people who are hopeful about legislation. We never know. But I do think local communities have to make those decisions. Are we going to have local taxpayer dollars being utilized for the deportation of people who are residents in our own community? And then how do we treat one another if and when that system comes into effect?
Well, I guess that's my question. That at the federal level, you have the Supreme Court and you got Congress, but at the local communal level, even cities and states still have the opportunity to pass their own legislation, regardless of what the Supreme Court says and does?
No, not on immigration, unfortunately, because immigration and even the Supreme Court on a number of rulings has decided that it's a federal issue. It's one of the unique subsets that's federal, which is also why it's a civil violation. It's not a criminal violation when someone is here without documentation. The Supreme Court said, by the way, to be here without documentation is not a crime. And so, unfortunately, it does have to be federally decided. Now, how local resources are used is a different question. I mean, about half of all people who end up in deportation proceedings are there because they don't have access to identification. They get pulled over for a traffic violation or a checkpoint, and they end up in immigration detention, which is why you're twice as likely to get detained if you're black and you're undocumented, because more black people are pulled over by the police. I mean, there are some things local communities can do, but unfortunately, this is a conversation we're going to have as an entire nation.
I thought this was an insightful question. Hi, Pastor Ryan. We know the problems, but what are we proposing should be done? Are we asking for open borders, which is one of those phrases that you hear frequently? Are we asking for open borders to solve immigration issues? Or can we do much in the countries where people are coming from to support social and economic stability to allow people to stay?
Open borders is one of these buzzwords that gets thrown around very effectively as if there's some sort of dichotomy between open borders and closed borders, and we have to choose one or the other. Open borders is what we had when a number of my ancestors came. This is when Ellis Island was open and you could just show up and come. And in the earlier days than that, even more ancestors stole land from my other ancestors because they just showed up and said, well, this is my land, right? That was truly open borders. Open borders is what we have for our iPhones, right? This iPhone has more rights than a lot of people in this room. And so I just want to say that's a red herring. It's used often in these narratives, but the reality is people move across continents every day. And so I may get in a little bit of trouble, but I'm here to be honest. I am not one of those purists, nor are most of the members of our organization that say no deportation should ever happen, right? We just had a Russian spy who served jail time and then like a couple weeks ago got deported back to Russia, right? And probably would have continued to spy if she was still here. I think it's a rare, different case. What I haven't understood is why we use it as a mechanism at all when it's completely ineffective and shown to be incredibly costly. But let me say that I think for most people of faith, the question isn't necessarily are we open borders or closed borders. It's what I suggested in my talk. How do we create this global understanding of the kingdom of God, and how are we going to treat one another? Do we actually believe that someone should be able to have a shot at becoming a citizen? And what does citizenship really mean? I mean, I'm a citizen because I was born in the United States. That's not a lot of work. My mom did all that work, you know. But I often feel when we have elections, when I was in the Navy Chaplain Corps, we would go out recruiting, that we take our citizenship for granted. When there are folk who cross entire oceans, are separated from their family for months, years, just at a shot at that same citizenship. And so, I mean, I don't want to take it for granted. I think there can be a clean, orderly system that comes out that actually lines up with American values. And I think also, like, we're in a global migration moment right now. We will be for the rest of our lives. There's no wall, there's no single piece of legislation that solves that. We have to decide as a people, how are we going to be welcome to people that are moving from place to place for the rest of our lives? And then legislation that lines up with those values. And let me be really clear about this too. When we think about immigration, we often think about the laws. I would suggest that a law is simply a value at a given point in time among the people who have power. And the shift in values is what is going to create sustainable legislation around immigration. And so that's why I just call us to sort of a higher conversation than closed borders or open borders.
So somebody, this I actually think dovetails very nicely. Somebody asked, what does Define American do besides media? And I'd like to add to that this quote that I told you that I wanted to share from Jose's book. I never felt protected by the law. I didn't understand why the law was the way it was. To pass as an American, I always had to question the law, not just break it, not just circumvent it, but question it. I had to interrogate how laws are created, how legality must be seen through the prism of who is defining what is legal for whom. I had to realize that throughout American history, legality has forever been a construct of power. So there's kind of two questions in here. One of them has to do with what is that part of the reason or one of the main driving reasons why Define American has chosen the pathway that it has chosen in the work and the advocacy that you're doing? And then I guess the implied question is, how are we as general everyday people then kind of following your lead to relate then based upon the narrative relationship that we should have, but then how should we relate to the law as well with that?
I mentioned Harvey Milk. Mid-1970s, learning from what was already happening in Europe, Harvey Milk and his group of organizers in San Francisco decided they're going to start a coming out campaign. And they said, we have to share our stories with the people that we know and love. We have to come out because we have to change the narrative. 20 years later, shows like Will and Grace hit the television screen, and people across America are introduced to a gay monogamous couple, LGBT relationships, functioning families that look just like theirs on the television screen. A couple years later, Ellen DeGeneres comes out. And we start to see this sea change in culture towards being open, at least, and more tolerant in communities like where I grew up to LGBTQ folk. By the time we reach this decade, the Supreme Court is ruling that same-sex couples can get married. And a guy like me, who grew up in Appalachia in a Southern Baptist church, is rushing to the courthouse because my friend Ben wants to be the first to marry his boyfriend. There was never a bill that passed federally that said they could get married. Culture had shifted. My home state, again, in Kentucky, 2/3 of our legislature is Republican, very evangelical conservative. There's a supermajority in the House. We just had a Republican governor who is also very anti-LGBT. But they didn't pass a single anti-LGBT piece of legislation. Not a single one. Because they knew the culture had changed. What I'm suggesting is that with our work at Define American, with the stories that we tell, with the difficult conversations that we need to have in community, we're shifting our culture so it's more welcoming to newcomers and more inclusive. That's the type of change that we need to have. In that time in the 1970s, newspapers were calling LGBTQ folk, even the San Francisco Chronicle, horrific names. Today in the United States of America, newspapers call folks like Jesus and others that we've shown, Julie, illegal, anchor baby, results of chain migration, all of these hate group terms that are dehumanizing. Each of us can choose to use language that is more reflective of humanization. Each of us can share our own stories about migration. Each of us can challenge our local media to not just ask immigrants what they care about immigration, but ask them what they care about their community. As if it was a groundbreaking idea that they're full humans and actually may care about things other than immigration. And so I just think that's the sea change that we're trying to bring about. It's letters to the editor, it's difficult conversations at the Thanksgiving dinner. It's creating welcoming community and creating continued spaces for conversations like these. Raise your hand if you love holidays with all of your family everywhere. You don't have to lie. It's okay. Some people have amazing families. I think, look, for those of us who have various forms of privilege, I do want to underscore that it's critically important in moments like these for us not to expect marginalized and oppressed people to bear the entire burden of fighting their way out of marginalization and oppression. We have a role. And those of us who have privilege, if we created these systems that are doing the oppressing, it's up to us to upend and deconstruct those systems. And so if folks like Jesus can get up in front of all of us and share that they're undocumented publicly and openly and to all these folk in an era where that could, months from now, if DACA goes away, mean deportation. Goodness sake, if we can't have a conversation with other folk of privilege about how we define American and about what kind of country we want to build. And so I know that it's really polarizing to have these difficult conversations right now. We've even stopped often using in our work the word immigrant because we've discovered that when you even say the word immigrant now, folks tune out psychologically and go to their polls. But out of love, in communities of faith, in families, and then through things like sports and comedy, we can begin to stretch one another and meet each other where we are and inch towards different perception about particularly new Americans. I am really afraid, Kevin, about where we're at as a country and our ability to allow space for redemption. I have family members who are Trump voters. I have an uncle who, years ago, we were staying there, and I was in the guest bedroom, and I looked up after sleeping in the guest bed, and above the bed was a giant picture of a guy in a white robe. And I went to my aunt who was cooking breakfast, and I said, what is that about? And she said, oh, don't worry, that's just your uncle's daddy. I said, oh, that makes me a lot more worried. But that's my uncle. As hateful as what he's presenting is, and as destructing as how he votes and acts is to the people that I love, if I fail to at least believe in some sense of redemption for him, and that's going to look different for every person. I believe also in reconciliation, and you have to have a full sort of account of harm that you've done to other people. But if I stop believing in redemption is possible for him and stop trying to have a conversation, I just don't know honestly where that ends. If their side says, well, we can't have America if your side is here, and we say, well, we can't have a real America if your side isn't here, I just hate to sort of discover where that ends. And so I just have to believe that redemption is still possible. If you got to use comedy, use comedy.
You have a quick question?
Yeah, a quick question. Some of these DACA came from the military.
Yes, there are. There's some in the military. We have deported veterans. Some folk that I served with, we've deported. There's a veterans house in Mexico that does incredible work because a lot of the vets don't have anywhere to go when they get deported. But that is true. I have a friend, Jesus, who, it's a different Jesus, who's a lawyer right now, DACA recipient in the Army, and yes, absolutely.
What are the alternate terms that you use instead of immigrant?
New American, I use a lot. Other identities. Sometimes people like to use what their status is, but statuses shift, as you know. I mean, and so I prefer New American, anything with the word American in it.
One of the things that we wanted to cover and go over were maybe the top 3 or 4 rhetorical objections that are within the popular culture. We had a couple questions come in, and please forgive me, I'll try to get to all the questions that you guys submitted, in addition to having difficult conversations. But there was also some questions about clarifying what really is the current policies. And, you know, the big question is pathways to citizenship. One of those questions that is popularly stated as well is why don't people just quote unquote get in line? And so I think maybe we'll start with that. And one of the reasons why we wanted to do this is very much in line with the idea that we're hoping that by your participation in this event today that you feel better equipped, based upon the video, emotionally equipped, but then also you have some information or understanding for how to have those difficult conversations. And maybe it's just helpful for you as well. Maybe some of you are still wrestling with your personal philosophy on what you actually think should be appropriate policies or the outplay of your faith. So we wanted to go through some of those objections and then to hear Ryan share. So let's just start with that one. I'm all for legal immigration. Why don't immigrants or undocumented Americans just get in line for the process? That's one of the things.
Yeah, I mean, this is a question that we get all the time. And I think it's a relatively simple question that many folk think would require a simple answer if our immigration system were simple. It's among the most complex. I went to law school, but then left for divinity school, thank God. But when I started, yes, when I started first reading into the various laws that we have on the books around immigration, I was stunned at just how complex it was. And so we worked at Define American with a team of over a dozen lawyers to put together a graphic that tried to get to this complexity because it was a question that we got so much. I don't know, Kevin, if you have the ability to put that graphic.
Which one?
Up. The game of getting legal is what we called it. And you can see that for folk who don't have status, this is quite a game. And almost everything on this map, for those of you who can't read it because the lettering is too small, ends in a no and you're screwed. Sorry, there's no path for citizenship for you. Some potential paths that have been carved out previously are not available under this administration. So you asked earlier whether there are people who have DACA that are serving currently in our military. Yes, that's true. There used to be an opportunity through what's called the MAVNI program that allowed DACA recipients with special skills to enlist in the military, that then eventually, after their term of service, could make them eligible for legal status, which they then could wait a number of years and apply for citizenship. That program has been ended. So there's no longer a program that is available to people. It used to be up until a year and a half ago legal, still is legal technically, for people to come to this country and apply for asylum. That is legal to apply for, a process for asylum. Now with the stay in Mexico policy that's implemented under this administration, our government is paying the Mexican government not very much money compared to the challenge to keep everyone in Mexico so that they have no legal ability, they have no physical ability to actually apply for asylum. And so it's very difficult. I mean, the simplest answer to the why don't you just get legal is there is no line, there is no possibility for the majority of folks to get legal. If our founder, Jose Antonio Vargas, were to leave this country tomorrow and go back to the Philippines, which is a country that has a president who is very anti-LGBT and has imprisoned journalists. He's an LGBT journalist. Could be dangerous. But even if he did, he would face automatically, as would everybody, a 10-year bar from re-entering the country. So after that 10-year period, in the Philippines, it's 18 years before you can apply. That's the length of the line, quote unquote. You can reapply. The overwhelming majority of those applications are denied. And so then you wait another series of years. So by that time, most people, you're talking about decades potentially before you can even really apply for legal status once you've been here without documentation. And that's what's facing particularly the 11 million undocumented folks that are here, half of whom came here legally and overstayed a visa. So the idea that our border is porous, which is crap, and that undocumented folks committed an illegal act, it's all just frankly factually untrue. Half of folk overstayed. Last year, the biggest increase in undocumented population was actually from Canada. Over the last decade, the biggest increase in population, in undocumented population, comes from Asia. And so there's a lot of rhetoric that doesn't quite meet the reality that people are unfortunately facing.
One person writes, which is I think very much in line with another question that we had. As a person who founded a nonprofit to support undocumented families and have been walking in solidarity, I struggle to envision what to advocate regarding reform. What paths of reform do you envision that can be sustainable? This is like an economic question. If we open borders with open arms, you already addressed that. How can we absorb the costs of education, healthcare that come with it? What criteria do you envision for allowing immigration of the poor at a pace that we could support? Because one of the objections isn't immigration a drain on our society, financially, economically, et cetera?
It's hard not to find a racial element in this because of our perception of people's possibility. Maria, who I spoke about earlier, showed up at the border with nothing but what she was carrying and her 4-year-old son, with tied up plastic bags as shoelaces. But prior to the drought in her country, she was a graduate level educated woman that had done accounting in a fairly well-off family. We have undocumented doctors and lawyers in this country. We have children of refugees and asylum seekers that have become the creators of some of the biggest companies in the United States of America. The majority of Fortune 500 companies in the United States are founded by immigrants. You're twice as likely to start a business in the United States if you're an immigrant. You're 4 times as likely if you're undocumented. Why? You can't legally be employed. So we have millions of entrepreneurs starting businesses so that they can feed their families. That's the kind of spirit I think that we need in a renewal of America, where we've seen wages fairly stagnant and the wealth gap between the super wealthy and the poor grows. So I do challenge the premise on its face that new Americans are somehow more prone to need support, financial support, because the numbers don't bear it out. The majority of research, DACA is a great example. These originally 800,000 young people have higher rates of college graduation than any other single demographic in the entire country. And all that happened because we allowed them to legally go to school. So the question for me wouldn't be, well, is there some drain on the economy in the first few years? But over time, do we believe still in the United States of America, in the American dream, and the ability for someone to achieve that dream, and in the ability for people to have possibility? I mean, look, I am a person of faith, and I have to read into possibility of people when I read stories of David and Goliath. Everyone looked at David as somebody who was going to get his butt kicked and then ruin the entire country's chances. But David had some things in his sling and had some possibility. And that's the spirit that I really am afraid that we lose if we don't have newcomers who, for better or worse, as true or untrue as it is, buy into the American dream that we, for centuries, have spread across the world and said, if you come here, you got a shot, only in America. And now, in 2019, we act shocked when those people who we've said across the world come here for the American dream show up on our doorstep ringing our doorbell. You can't come in, I'm sorry. And at the same time, in the same border, have a sign on one side in Juarez that says, help wanted, and a sign on our side of the border that says, stay out. All because we're addicted to cheap labor. And so my question additionally would be, not are these folks a drain on society, but can we create an economy that hasn't just moved from the enslavement of people to the indentured servanthood of people to requiring an entire workforce that pays people low wages so that we can have cheap food when we go to Whole Paycheck. And by Whole Paycheck, I mean Whole Foods. I think that's what we have to reckon with. A quarter of all restaurant workers in the entire country are undocumented. In cities, that's over half. Are we willing to have an economy that works for all people? And so, yes, there is some data, to be truthful, that in some communities, when there is a dramatic influx of newcomers, there is some competitiveness in the working class job market. Over time, more people has grown economies significantly. You can see that in communities like Dayton, Ohio, that was hemorrhaging jobs and people because manufacturing left. And they made a bold move, and that was to recruit immigrants. And now, 2 decades later, Dayton, Ohio is one of the most growing communities. They lost their tax base because so many people were leaving. And they said, well, let's welcome immigrants. They have rejuvenated communities. And so, I think it's about what the possibility is we view in people, not whether we view them as some sort of, drain on an economy that doesn't have an abundance.
Okay, so you said you came here for truth-telling. I want to push into the uncomfortable conversation of race and racism at the heart of many of this. One of the objections that we wrote down is, I just don't feel like this is my country anymore. Immigrants are changing our country, our value. They're bringing their religion and customs, and it's just not America anymore, right? This kind of rhetoric. And I had asked you, and I was wondering if you wouldn't mind sharing and expounding upon, to call somebody or to call out racism seems to be one of the most ineffective ways of actually calling out racism. And so, given that race and racism and racial ideas are so much at the foundation of this, what is the appropriate strategy, perspective in being a truth teller about that reality without greater polarization? Like you talked about redemptive movements of people. So can you walk us through that? Because it feels to me as if we simply talk about policies and compassion without talking about the root causes, then we're doing a disservice to what is actually driving the rhetoric and the ideas and the emotions, etc. But to go there seems to only polarize and cause people to revolt. And so walk us through that.
Yeah, to me, it's not a question of whether we go there or not. It's a question of how. Right. I think fundamentally as a country, we have failed to disentangle ourselves from our original sins. One of those sins had an element of adopting an American identity that was tied to whiteness. And what a lot of folks, I think, in a conversation about dismantling systems of racism, start to recognize eventually is that in order to adopt a sense of privilege as white folk, we had to give up something along the way. That's the untold story that we don't often tell. That we are not truly free to be who we are until we've undone those systems. When you come to the United States of America, you may come as a German, burgher or an Irish shoemaker, but eventually you become white. I was in Georgia with our founder years ago, and a young man who talked a lot like me came up, and he looked at Jose before our event. Jose's Filipino. It's not Mexican. It's a Spanish colonialism thing. And he said, "Where are you from?" And Jose said, "I'm from Mountain View, California." "Where are you from?" And the kid said, "I'm from here." "What do you mean?" And the kid goes, "No, but where are you from?" Jose said, "Yeah, from California, but where are you from?" And Jose said, Well, I think what you mean is that I am from the Philippines, but I grew up in California. Where are you from? And he said, oh, I'm white. I'm an American. And Jose said, well, white is not a country. But that's the reason that now every classroom that I go into when I teach, I ask everybody to introduce themselves and I ask them where they're from. And growing up as a white person in this country, you're never asked, where are you from? It means something different when you're asked the question. And I always ask the kids, where are you from? Do you know? And what's sad about that is the disdain that's on their faces when they don't know. They haven't even had to reckon with the fact that they come from somewhere. And what did we lose when we did that? I think that's a tragedy with our adoption of privilege and whiteness that we've got to unpack. And I think there are repercussions for that. When Muhammad Ali, the most famous person from my town, Louisville, died a couple years ago. And I didn't know what to do the night that he died. It was early mornings. We get the text. And I go over they were about to open up his childhood home as a museum. So I just go to his home early morning. And his brother Rahman is there. And I ended up spending the day with Rock on the front porch of his childhood home. And about halfway through the day, Rock turns to me and he said, hey, Ryan, we're family. And I said, Rock, that means a lot. I appreciate that. And he said, no, we're kin. We're related. And I said, Rock, I don't know if you can tell. I'm a white guy. And he said, no, don't you have some Irish in you? And I said, yeah, far back, some Irish. And he said, well, Ryan, one day I was sitting on the front porch with Muhammad, and we asked Granddaddy, we said, Granddaddy, are you white? And he kind of leaned back in his rocking chair, and he said, no, sons, I guess I'm not white. He was Irish. It was a great book, How the Irish Became White. And at that time, he wasn't treated as if he was white. And we continued to create these systems because of our inability to view American as the most diverse, inclusive country in the world with its marriage to whiteness. And I just think, I always thought the Alis supported immigration because they were Muslim. I didn't realize that they supported immigration because they come from a lineage of Irish immigrants who were discriminated against in Louisville, Kentucky. Who years ago, the last time that a political party called the Know Nothing Party, you can Wikipedia it, went all in on xenophobia and came into power. In Louisville, Kentucky, we had a thing called Bloody Monday, and on Election Day, dozens of Irish and German immigrants of the lineage of the Alis were murdered on Election Day for trying to go and vote. That's the last time that a political party went all in on xenophobia in America. Now, thankfully, there's another election coming up next year. The Know Nothing Party we know nothing about because they were so soundly defeated, they dissolved within 2 election cycles. But I think we have to unpack it. I think we have to talk about race. We did a study before we did a film called White People on MTV. MTV commissioned a study, and they discovered in that study that over 90% of all white people have 0 friends of color. They also discovered that among the millennial population, the majority of white young millennials believe that they face more discrimination than people of color. And that gave us justification to go around and say, we got to do this film. But we went around D.C., New York, to try to raise, support for it. And all our partners within the immigrant freedom movement said, please don't do this. Please don't do a film about race. It's the third rail. We're about to pass comprehensive immigration reform. You're going to mess it all up. And we said, we got to talk about race. Everywhere we go, eventually, if you talk about immigration enough, you got to talk about race. And so we did. And we discovered all kind of things. 3.3 million people watched it within the first week. And now it's a common practice, I think, to talk about migration practices and race. But I think we have to. I think for me, it's questioning first. So with my brothers and sisters who, for them, hearing that they may be racist or have some racist tendencies is the most evil thing you could ever say about them. It's asking questions. What does an American look like? Let's talk about that. Do you have to have white European heritage to be an American? If you think so, why? Name folk that they come into contact with. Was that person less American than you? There's a starting point for every person. We just have to be willing to meet them where they are and be willing to stretch to in that conversation. But I think we have to talk about it. Because otherwise our own freedom is still locked up.
Can you give us 2, maybe 3 bullet points? Do this, don't do this. I'm sensing like one of the emotional postures is the bravery and the courage to actually broach the subject. I'm sensing another one, which is have patience with people, which I think is really difficult for those of us who want to have redemptive conversations with people who hold to such offensive ideas sometimes. It's like to have patience with people. So is there any, can you give us some handholds, maybe one or 2?
So the first thing I'll say is don't expect people who are being dehumanized to be the bridge builder all the time. I want to reiterate that. If someone is starting from a place where they don't view you as a full human, it is not a requirement that that's a person that you engage. And I say that to say, I did this 2 days ago. I posted an article about the new report that 70,000 young people this year have been locked in cages, separated from their families. And we did a study in the Families Belong Together Coalition that 87% of all Americans are against putting those kids in cages. If you are a person that's in the 13% that believes it's okay to take a child for any reason, but let alone a child whose parents got them here seeking safety or opportunity, and you think it's okay to put that child in prison and tear them away from their family, I'm not sure you have the capacity to be in a fully humanized conversation yet. We got some more work to do. Now, that poll also revealed for us that half of everyone who said it was wrong to put the kids in cages, when we asked them, what do you do with the parents? The majority said, throw them in jail and throw away the key. Now, I would suggest there's some conversation opening there. What makes that parent's decision to try to provide a better life for their child different than your decision or your parents' decision to provide a better life for you? Let's talk about that. What's in that? Unpack that for a while, right? So that's one. Number 2, use the power of story. I tell folk all the time that are nervous about getting into conversations about immigration because they don't know all the ins and outs. First of all, immigration attorneys don't know all the ins and outs. So don't worry about that. But secondly, you can debate on policy and issues. No one can debate with your story. You are an expert in your own story and your own experience. You came to the conclusions that you now have somehow. So use the power of story. Keep it embedded in story. Keep it embedded in questions. Meet people where they are. And then try to find 2 things. Common ground on anything. It may be the smallest thing, but at least find common ground on that thing at the human fundamental level. And then what we discovered in the LGBTQ rights movement when churches were trying to wrestle with this subject, and they still are, is that having common aspirations can help. So let's get out of the muck and the messiness and the polarization and the world is going to end if we have open borders and all this stuff. What do we aspire to together? What kind of country would you like to have? The wall and building it, that's not a type of country. It is. But I don't think people aspire to live in walled up communities. Really. I mean, that's a temporary, like, let's do that thing now because we know it can be torn down kind of thing, like it was in Germany. But what do we aspire to? What kind of country do we want to be? And I think we can find commonality around that.
That's really good. Ryan, we're coming to the end of our time. You have a beautiful group of people here from Congregation Eitz Chaim, Spark.Church, some from the public. What would be your last clarion encouraging word, directive to us regarding all of this? Give you the last you're something else moment. And then I'll ask Rabbi Chaim to close us in a benediction.
Yeah. Thank you, and thank you for having me. It is really incredible to be in a community like yours. I think this is a special place, and when I don't use the word beloved community lightly, and I think that's what you're trying to build here, and I've experienced that all in one evening, and I wish I could bottle this up and take it across the country, and I am hopeful that you'll continue to grow, not just in number, but in community with each other. I was with my friend Desmond Meade last week. Desmond just last year ran the campaign to get 1.7 million voter rights restored for people who had committed a crime in Florida. And Desmond, when asked this question, I talked about allyship and how what we don't need is just more allies and what that meant. And I described it in one way, he described it another. I said, if allyship, which is what people often refer to me as when I go into these spaces, means shutting up, sitting down, and sitting on the sidelines and just watching, I'm out. Some of my people, who I will one day join in the dirt, created this oppression. And if I'm going to sit back and watch as it happens and sit back and watch a movement happen in my lifetime and not be a part of it, I'm out. So, as my friend and our founder, Jose, said the other day, we don't need allies, we need co-conspirators. Co-conspirators in creating a more inclusive America, more beloved communities, more communities of resistance. In response to that, my friend Desmond said, Ryan, it's like a ham and egg omelet. And that's what we need. I said, what do you mean? And he said, well, every one of us has different roles, and we got to figure out which role is ours. And when you made an omelet, the cow made some contributions. The chicken made some contributions. The cheese, the egg. But the pig went all in. And he said, we need people willing to go all in. And as thousands of folks are at our border, as billions of dollars are about to be spent on dehumanizing, hate-filled rhetoric to make us believe that some folk among us are less than human, which would then justify them being put in camps, or worse, I fear. Some of us have to be willing to go all in. All of us have to make a contribution. And that would be, I can't tell you what contribution you need to make, but if we can't make it now, then God help us.